I just have my example of your book here.
Oh, is that
Carried around.
Listen, I really appreciated your comments this morning because, you know,
thanks for
you put stuff out there,
Absolutely, yeah,
people
glad to be here.
respond to
Thanks.
it.
No,
And it's somebody independently just says, this is great. I really appreciate
it really is
Just so
good
you
stuff.
know,
Yeah.
just so you know, that was meeting.
I'm Carter Ron.
Yeah.
Paula, don't we ask you, because you know why I asked you this? I interacted with him, admittedly not on water, but of course I was under Secretary of State.
It's a pretty good crowd, huh?
very good crowd, yeah. Very nice. I read the list of
He does, you know, he has a
responses,
big
and I was
center in
impressed.
Northern Ireland.
You don't know how many of those are
Pacific
actually going to
Ireland.
materialize.
Very
He
true.
created it, so
Very
it's all
true.
about the history of
But I think
the
this
Irish
worked very nicely.
and Irish leadership in the world. He is, let's see, today he is in Provence. A month ago he was in Atlanta, and then before that he was in his house in South Africa and Cape Town. So
Well, look, thank you.
soon enough he'll be in Barbados.
Nice, nice. I hope you didn't mind my asking.
No.
But I
Anyway.
was in Atlanta and they listed Coca-Cola. You know,
Yeah.
I was there for a Coca-Cola thing, so
Yeah, well,
anyhow.
Anyway,
But anyhow, thank
Nice.
you very much.
Roger Mark?
I just want to say hello to Roger.
Carter Lee Gunn, good to meet you.
Let's see, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Roger, yeah.
Wow, a full house. This is awesome. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct the programs on global sustainability and resilience here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I'm excited to see that we have so many people here with us today in person. We've had more than 200 RSVPs for this event, so we know that we have many people who are also tuning in online. And it's great. This is such an amazing topic. Water security in U.S. foreign policy. It's our book launch, the culmination of a collaborative project with WWF. And if you haven't gotten your signed copy of the book, please make sure that you do so. I know many of you are familiar with the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're the living memorial to President Wilson, established by Congress, and we focus on key international development priorities. And just last week, interestingly, we are deliberately bipartisan in our approach. And just last week, we had an amazing opportunity to welcome Vice President Pence to the Wilson Center. And this is what he had to say about us. He said, "You guys are really an institution of independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas, a truly bipartisan stroll here in Washington, D.C., and that the Wilson Center has a unique perspective on America's essential role in global affairs. That's been true since the founding of the center in 1968. You recognize that the world looks to America as a standard bearer for freedom, that American strength is critical to peace, prosperity across the wider world." And as I reflect on those words from Vice President Pence, I think of the book, because very much we're looking in the book at the connections between water security and U.S. foreign policy. And we try to do that in our work here at the Wilson Center in a transdisciplinary way, across disciplines. And we were recognized by the University of Pennsylvania as the #1 think tank globally for transdisciplinary research. So our collaboration with WWF on these issues and welcoming the political elite to the center is very much a part of what we do. So in that spirit, we're really enthusiastic to welcome you to today's event as we launch this book. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome Carter Roberts, who many of you know quite well, to give us some opening remarks. As you know, he's the president and CEO of World Wildlife Fund in the United States. You have his bio. But as I look at how you describe WWF, I'm quite struck that it's described as the world's largest conservation network, that it centers its work on the protection of places that are most important to the survival of species and people, and that it engages individuals in making informed environmental choices, working with communities, governments, and businesses. So these themes of information, engagement, and partnership, I think, forms the basis of our collaboration together on this project, and I see these themes reflected in the book. So Carter said, be brief, be quick, and don't talk about my background. So I'm following your orders. But welcome to you, and I'd like to ask Carter to come up to kick us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger Mark. And here, the bottom line is the background of all the panelists is far more interesting than mine. So my job is basically to open this up, and we are grateful for our partnership and for the chance to launch this work here with you, Roger Mark, and with all your colleagues. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. This is an awfully important topic, and it's an important topic at this moment in time. When people ask me about the current administration and environmental leadership within its cabinet, I am quick to talk about Secretary Mattis and all the things that he has said over time about the relationship between the environment, natural resources, and a stable climate to stable societies around the world and the security of the United States. It's not that complicated. When you have a healthy environment and people have the ability to feed their families, it is a key ingredient for stable and prosperous societies around the world. And when you lose that, it sows the seeds for insecurity and conflict with all the many repercussions that we see around the world. It's complicated, obviously, by climate change. The UN High Commission on Refugees estimates that something like 22 million people in the world are refugees, either internal or external to countries, as a result of climate and weather conditions. The AAAS estimates that number is going to grow to 50 million by the middle of this century. And so we definitely have our work cut out for us. And at WWF, I love the description. I don't know who wrote that within our shop, but I love the description of our organization because it is true that our role is really to provide communities, businesses, governments with tools to address these kind of complex situations. And in the context of what we're talking about today, it's all about the ability to understand the dynamics of resource scarcity, particularly with a depleted environment, the context of the inability to predict which crops to grow in conditions where water is becoming more scarce and less predictable, and the ability to predict the effects of climate change over time. So we built all kinds of programs. We love our collaboration with parts of the U.S. government, and particularly the National Intelligence Council. Rod, you're somewhere in here. There you are. It's good to see you. The state and defense departments and many more. And we are increasingly being engaged with countries and governments around the world as these changes are accelerating all around us. So the opportunity to study water and to study the complications for stability and security around the world has led us to this partnership with many of you to look at 14 countries to understand how that plays out in the context of countries with different economies, different circumstances. And that work has been ably led by David Reed, the senior policy fellow at WWF, who sits to my left. And this is really a labor of love of his, and in partnership with the panelists who are here on stage and so many of you. It is a topic that is fundamental to our work at WWF, and it makes our work ever more relevant to the governments around the world who are wrestling and grappling with this set of issues. And so with that, I'm gonna ask David to stand up and start this session, and I'll get out of the way. Thanks very much.
Indeed, thank you very much, Carter. It is a great honor to be with you here today. And Carter, thank you for explaining this imperative, this urgency, if you will, that led WWF to undertake this research, to understand this relationship between water and our security. To set a context for our discussion with our really extraordinary panelists today, I would like to highlight 3 points from the book that explain what is this water-driven link to U.S. security issues. And that first water-driven threat, if you will, that we examined in the book regards the potential for transboundary conflict. For the chapters on Central Asia, the Mekong, the Tigris-Euphrates, and the Indus rivers explore these dynamics, potential conflictual dynamics, perhaps with the Indus and Central Asia as the most inflammable, if you will, of those contexts. But the authors of those 4 chapters hasten to say as well, it is not very likely that in the near term we will see kinetic engagements between those countries. The reason being that the costs and consequences of military-on-military conflict are simply too high. The needs of increasing water supply in each of those countries and the need to find long-term, shared, and sustainable responses and outcomes far outweighs the benefits of crushing each other's infrastructure and destroying communities. The second point that the analysts in this work have brought forward is that the most direct threats to U.S. security interests arise at local, subnational, and national levels, not at the transboundary level at this particular time. And a main cause of the resurgence of those local problems, those national problems, is a series of governance failures. Most of the governments that we looked at have water management regimes that were created literally decades ago. So that the regulations, the price signals, the data of yesteryear no longer match the conditions of today. And indeed, most of these governance mechanisms do not have the flexibility to respond to these new challenges, nor do they have arbitration mechanisms to deal with the rising number of conflicts that are taking place over water. Further, the analysts say that the key issue in understanding the dynamic of governance failures is that governments, those institutions of governance, are not neutral arbiters in the distribution of water allocation. They favor very clear social groups, and the social groups that are favored are usually the powerful and the privileged, which means in consequence that the more vulnerable communities are those that bear the brunt of that biased distribution of water and water assets. The analysts also point out that those vulnerable communities are often defined along ethnic, cultural, and linguistic lines. So it is not surprising that the conflicts that are arising today have this clear ethnic, cultural, and linguistic cleavage to them. An equally important driver of national level threats to U.S. security interests is what we have called the erosion of rural livelihoods, All the countries we looked at have many challenges. Sometimes it's economic downturn, sometimes it's just poverty in general, it's insurgency, it's corruption. But the minute that you add to that this issue of water scarcity and the need to have stable access to water, those factors converge and escalate very quickly and indeed threaten the stability and the viability of governance. They can become, as we have seen, society-wide disruptions. And really, this is not surprising because water is foundational. Water is life or death. Water is prosperity or stagnation. And as rural livelihoods, as our analysts demonstrate, begin to collapse, additional destabilizing processes begin to unfold. One of those is obviously migration. Nigeria, Iran, India, and elsewhere have witnessed the movement of tens of millions of people as they move from the countryside to urban centers. And after arriving in urban centers to find also despair, they move to borders. And they oftentimes now cross continents, as we have seen in Nigeria and Syria moving to Europe, and indeed, as we recognize is happening in Central America to northward to the United States. Another response to this erosion of rural livelihoods is the predisposition to become involved in various insurgencies. For the lack of economic opportunity, for lack of social services, the sense of desperation, it is not surprising then that desperate people join such insurgencies. In the book, we looked at the examples of Abu Sayyaf, the Taliban, and Boko Haram. And all of these then have consequences for regional stability that runs counter to United States security interests. And another final response to this is drug trafficking. While people have few livelihood options with a promise of immediate financial income, they don't hesitate at times from joining narcotics networks. This is pretty serious when you look at the fact that 50%, that's 50% of the geography of Guatemala is purportedly controlled by narco traffickers. And this, of course, then has networks that influence our well-being here. So it is that these factors, governance failures, erosion of rural livelihoods, and putting people in motion, if you will, has serious consequences for our national security interests. My third and final point then is, how is the United States responding to these challenges? The United States has an absolutely extraordinary array of assets to respond to these challenges, whether it's remote sensing of surface and groundwater, whether it's technological innovation, whether it's construction technology, whether it's training, diplomatic skills. It is a formidable arsenal. Our overseas water engagement responses are channeled through three basic pathways. The first is through our bilateral development assistance, USAID, for example. The second, through our engagements with the multilateral organizations, namely the World Bank and regional development banks. And then thirdly, through geostrategic interventions that have both a kinetic as well as a soft response to areas of particular threat, Middle East being a good example. If you were, however, to try to identify a unifying theme, a strategy that weaves those three pathways together, you'll be hard-pressed to find it. The fact is that we have not had an integrated, coherent strategy for the past several decades. If we were to scratch and try to identify one, we could say, well, yes, the U.S. has been a provider of services, of water services. Yes, we have provided access to water for hospitals and communities and schools. But what about the upstream management of resources? What about changing, upgrading the governance mechanisms, the regulations? What about preparing these communities for the impacts of climate change, increasing the resilience to the impacts that are yet to come? And there we have a major shortcoming and vacuum that we need to fill. So indeed it is a credible array of assets, opportunities there before us. Lacking is the strategy that we desperately need. So with that, then, I would now take my seat. And I would like to introduce our extraordinary panelists. We're really fortunate to have them with us today. The first is General Jim Jones, who is founder and president of Jones Group International. That is an international consulting firm. General Jones served as President Obama's first national security advisor, and prior to that, he served as the 32nd Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. After giving up that post, he assumed the positions of Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Commander United States European Command. Our second panelist is Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, a foreign policy expert and former diplomat specializing in national security affairs. She is currently a senior fellow at the Future of Diplomacy project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and vice chair of the National Executive Committee of the U.S. Water Partnership. She has held many senior-level positions in the United States government, including as Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs from 2001 to 2009. And our third panelist is Admiral Lee Gunn, who is Vice Chairman of the Center for Naval Analysis Military Advisory Board. He served for 35 years in the U.S. Navy, and his last active Navy assignment was as Inspector General of the Department of the Navy. serving in surface Navy in a variety of theaters, commanding numerous squadrons and forces. So indeed, it is a great honor for now to move to a discussion. For the next 25 minutes, I would like to open a series of question and answers with our three panelists. After that, then, we will turn to you, the audience, for you to engage our honored guest today. And with that as an introduction, then, let me ask first General Jim Jones, as you look back on your 40 years of service in the military and in your capacity as National Security Advisor, what are the major changes that you have experienced as regards the role of water in shaping U.S. interests and changing our engagements around the world?
Well, thank you very much, David. It's an honor to be here and to see Paula and Lee Gunn again. And I'd like to also recognize John Raitt, my longtime friend who has made his life's work to keep me focused on this and has done so much of the critical thinking that is part and parcel of how I spend a lot of my time now, and I can't imagine doing anything more important than participating in a panel such as this one. To answer your question, over a 40-year career, I think that the best way to answer that, where water is concerned, is that national and international security in the 21st century is a much broader portfolio for our government to think about than it was in the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century, say post-World War II, where we lived in a pretty much a black and white world with the Soviet Union on one side and everybody else on the other. It just seemed like even though the stakes were awfully high, they were manageable in terms of the international architecture, the institutions we set up. And the dialogue was really somewhat restricted to the Defense Department, maybe the National Security Council, and maybe a little bit of the State Department. But it was looking back, it was terrifying at times with the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera, but it was also a time when there seemed to be more order to how things were discussed, and institutions seemed to work better. In the 21st century, when I actually, starting with NATO, and starting with the emergence of non-state actors like Osama bin Laden and other terrorist organizations, the world seemed to get much more complicated. First of all, it was not a bipolar world anymore, it was multipolar. The threats were more diverse. We weren't really worried about global conflict, but we were worried about the rise of, as I said, non-state actors. And it seemed to me that other factors were critically asking to be part of the dialogue as it relates to national security, international security. And so by the time I got to the White House in 2009, we were looking at things like cybersecurity as an integral part of the NSC. I did try to get a senior director for energy security, but I was not quite successful in doing that. But I do believe it is a national security issue. And I'm absolutely stunned that today in this country we still have not articulated a national security strategy. That if anybody's seen one, please send me a copy because I'd love to read it. We do a lot of other things, but within that national energy strategy that we so desperately need, we get very, very quickly down to the one thing that really starts the ball rolling, and that's water insufficiency as a key driver of instability. And this relates to just about every conflict that's going on right now. It affects immigration issues, it affects the movement of masses and thousands of people, it causes wars. And right behind it, of course, I mean, actually almost co-located is food and water security to me are somewhat difficult to differentiate. But water is absolutely if you had to pick one, okay, I'd choose water because I'll last longer with water than without food, but not much. So it's a threat multiplier. It's contributed to civil wars. It can be used as a weapon. It can be it can also be, on the positive side, a central pillar for restabilization in the post-conflict. Without going on too long here, I think that we need to understand that our country needs a new, and I think other developed countries need a new engagement policy that starts to think about what we're going to do with the world of 11 billion people. How are we going to feed them? How are we going to give them adequate water, adequate food? What are we going to do about climate and basic energy? Because without that, everything stops. So I'm an advocate for what I call more proactive engagement to prevent future conflicts, to convince the hopeless people in the world that there is a nexus of security, economic development, governance, and rule of law that, when applied together, can give people hope that staying where they are gives them better future. But you have to have that security to start things off. But if you only have that, and if your only instrument for changing the world is military, it's not going to be enough in the 21st century. Maybe there was a time when it was enough, but we went through the Marshall Plan days and the reconstruction of Japan, and I thought we'd kind of figured it out. But if you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, and some of these other interventions where the military has been really the only critical application, those other two pillars have been really lacking: governance and an economic vision for the future. So, and I also think that the time when, in our country, where the public sector and the private sector do not work together is over. This problem with water has got to be a public and private sector cooperation. And I think the private sector in our country is so strong, so diverse, so innovative, that it can be seen as an instrument of our successful foreign policy. And that's what I think we should work for.
Thank you very much, General. I will then transition from a military perspective to more of a diplomatic perspective, Ambassador Dobriansky, if that's all right, and ask you and your ongoing work with the U.S. Water Partnership. The partnership really has played quite an instrumental role in bringing together, as General Jones just suggested, a number of wide-ranging partners, from the private sector, academia, civil society, and government, to promote a greater strategic focus on U.S. water. At the same time, the State Department, USAID, are spearheading the U.S. government's effort to develop a first ever global water strategy. Now, this congressionally mandated strategy needs to be submitted in October of this year. And could you outline what you believe the main challenges that the partners of the U.S. Water Partnership believe this strategy must address?
All right. Well, first, I'm delighted to be here. And Roger, Mark, and Carter, thank you both for your hosting in-house, and thank you for bringing us together. And also congratulations to you, David. I mean, really, what an incredible book. And I'm glad it's outside. And I like the fact when we were discussing, in fact, I'm going to steal maybe the Admiral's thunder. He said he had this for reading in Rome. And I thought, boy, you're very dedicated, because this is a detailed book.
I didn't read every word.
We're going to quiz you on the cases. But really, it's really an honor to be here and a privilege. And let me first begin with the U.S. Water Partnership, because I am honored indeed to be here on the platform with General Jones, who's part of the U.S. Water Partnership, and we've worked together, and also Admiral Gunn, and its leadership. I see a number of members of its leadership, Monica and Chuck here, and then Sherry Goodman, who's also on the executive committee. You know, for those of you who don't know it, the U.S. Water Partnership is really quite groundbreaking in many ways, because it is the quintessential public-private partnership. It brings together some 118 organizations that are very dedicated to not only just sharing data, sharing information, but looking at very practical issues and how do you tackle it, and also putting a spotlight on this issue. I want to pick out one that was most significant for me, and again, going back to General Jones and also Sherry Goodman, we all have a tie because we're all part of the Atlantic Council. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Atlantic Council, it is, as its president calls it, not a think tank, but a do tank. And that it does focus on a wide range of national security topics. Well, the Atlantic Council significantly chose water as one of its primary issues to address. And in fact, did put out a strategy that tries to make those linkages and to circulate it throughout the foreign policy community. I think that was absolutely essential. More needs to be done of that. I've seen that also. I saw later the Council on Foreign Relations. They have a water and U.S. national security document that they've put out. The more that this is spotlighted, the more that it becomes mainstreamed into the issue. Let me also mention, because you referred to the mandate, which you're referring to Senator Paul Simon's Water for the World Act, and the fact that a report has been congressionally mandated, the report being a global water strategy from the executive branch. And it is due this fall in October. And the State Department and USAID are working very extensively away on this. It started in the last administration, and it's going through this administration. I think it's key for several reasons. Not only the fact is, as David pointed out, that it is groundbreaking, it's the first of its kind, but also the fact that it has a whole approach in this, meaning that water often has been somewhat stovepiped in the way in which it gets dealt with in terms of certain sectors. But here, I think the significant thing is that there's a real emphasis, at least as I could see it, on a kind of whole-of-government approach to the issue, which I think does refer back to what General Jones was saying, and also you in your opening remarks. Also, I think that there's another fact here, and the fact is that there is an emphasis on looking at creative ways forward, and creative ways forward aren't going to only be through the U.S. government. It's got to be through the private sector and every aspect of the private sector, NGOs, academia, businesses, and so forth. So that's a backdrop. But now your core question. You asked me what would it be that I think that we would recommend, and what would be maybe three specific areas. I'd start with the importance of a reduction in water and sanitation disease. Because when you look at the figures, they're just very, very shocking, that up to, and maybe even more, 5,000 persons a day die from water-related and sanitation-related disease, and mostly affecting children 6 and under in this case. So a very firm goal would be to really state up front that our goal is to ensure that this does not happen, that water-related and sanitation-related disease, is in fact prevented. The second one would be relevant to the economic sector, because when you think about it, water is at the core of development. There are so many intersections in terms of, as you put it, livelihoods, whether it's the agricultural area, whether it's the energy area, and one could go on in terms of those specific linkages. So I think a second core area would be to ensure that water continues to be, but is maximized as a driver of economic growth, that is absolutely essential and critical. And that, by the way, in doing that there is this whole of government and this whole strategic approach in order to achieve that. And then thirdly, I would certainly pick out what you not only spoke about, but also certainly came out in the cases in the book, and that is the whole issue about water-driven conflicts and even wars. I mean, there has to be collaboration on water. That would be the absolute goal and mandate here, and that we work ultimately to ensure that there aren't conflicts or wars, localized wars that break out because of these issues. That shouldn't be the case. Instead, on the contrary, we should be looking for diplomatic and aggressive ways of forging consensus and figuring out how, even whether it's cross-border arrangements or otherwise, that you have collaboration to the good of local communities. That's how it should be. In fact, I could say that when I was an undersecretary, I remember in the southern tier of Latin America, there were some border issues relevant to dams. In fact, at the nexus there, Argentina, Uruguay especially. And, you know, the good news was the communities were looking for ways forward. So that would be the third and final that I would see as key strategic goals that we should be going forward with.
That's very helpful, and very thoughtful. It's very nice now to turn to Admiral Gunn, in that you have been working with the Military Advisory Board for the past number of years, looking at this, the water challenges from a climate perspective. What would you say are some of the main lessons that, and the conclusions that could be drawn from the deliberations that you have helped lead with Sherry Rosenblum and others in the Military Advisory Board? Bring us up to date on how you see these new challenges from your perspective, your vantage point.
Sure, and thanks very much for having me here with this great panel on this important topic. I'd like to start out by saying thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to World Wildlife Fund for having this event. This is a terrific kind of forum, and I appreciate being part of it. I'd also like to mention Sherry Goodman's name again. The Military Advisory Board is the brainchild of Sherry Goodman in 2006, and we have benefited from the direction that she set for us then and the spirit with which we've pursued this for the what is it, 11 years since then. It's been an amazing ride. There are now about to be 8 reports. We issued the 7th one 2 weeks ago, and I'd like to draw that into the conversation just a little bit. It has to do with energy. I'd also like to say that Sherry Rosenblum is here, and she is our current point person and guide. She's the executive director of the Military Advisory Board. I hope that most of you are familiar with the work the MAB has been doing since '06, but it's worth saying that there are now 35 of us, mostly retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals who have, from a variety of perspectives, you could imagine that all 5 services are represented, and career experiences, we've brought that perspective to the issues of climate change, energy, water, and national security. We try definitely to ensure that we stay in the lane of national security because, for one thing, that has been, in the last decade or so, a relatively new voice in the conversation about these terribly important topics. The advisory board released a report, as I said, 2 weeks ago, and it's called Advanced Energy and U.S. National Security. There is a copy, free, which David told me that I could bring several of, so they are out there. And the reason I bring this up, it's not a tangential issue. This is a central issue because there already is underway with a great deal of momentum, a shift to an advanced energy world. It will happen with or without the leadership of the United States. The research that we did in this report is intended to find out if there are tangible benefits to the United States other than the feel-good aspect of helping to lead the world in this transition to a new energy economy. The answer is, thank goodness, yes, absolutely. The research demonstrates that. The reason I bring it up here is because the energy framework is terribly important to the management of water worldwide. And those places where it's not only necessary to get the water situation under control, but also to provide for the energy demand that is going to increase. It's vital that that be done in a way that has as little impact on water as possible. And that means renewables. It means small nuclear reactors. It means wind, solar, geothermal. It means the proper use of hydroelectric production. Those things have a positive effect on the expenditure of water rather than the combustion energy production and the enormous demands that that places on the systems. We are in the final throes of producing the next report, the one on water. And just a couple things. We say, and these align very nicely with the fine book that you have put together, which I read in Rome.
I would not make the same claim myself.
Skimming the wave tops. Population growth, surging demand for energy, environmental changes are going to increase the severity of water stress in areas of strategic interest to the U.S. That's kind of an overarching point with you. Water stress contributes to instability and conflict, but as you said, it rarely is a direct cause of conflict among states. It can set the conditions for opportunists, as we see around the world. The strategic value of water and water infrastructure increases as the scarcity increases or as the abundance decreases. The reverse is true in all this too. Conflict can give rise to water insecurity and water stress. We also said that shared resources can become tools of one state over the interests of another. And countries have used irregular or asymmetric tactics to secure access to water. An interesting example, I think, comes out in the chapter on the Mekong Delta, in which the Mekong Regional Commission, with only 4 members of the 6 states that are directly involved in the Mekong River water usage, does not include China and Myanmar. And so China has created another water compact, which they lead, which has 6 nations in it. Now, I think that the conclusion the author draws is quite reasonable, that at least as part of the motivation for this, China's interested in the 3 of these commission members who are contesting China's excursions into the South China Sea. This is a perfect example, I think, of water used in that way. And finally, I think you're going to see in our report when it's published that this is not hopeless. As you said, the USAID, the banks and finance, by the way, the section on finance is terrific at the end of your book. Geostrategic partnerships are important. U.S. outreach through the commercial and private sector, I think, will also contribute. This is a whole of government approach that requires not just state and USAID and DOD, but it also is USDA and the IC and all the other elements of government. My experience on active duty was that the intergovernmental efforts were difficult to muster and sometimes didn't achieve the hoped for results. We'd like to see that overcome, and we advocate some ways to do that.
Admiral Gunn, if I could ask you to extend your comments to, have you reached agreements on recommendations that the MAB will set forth? Look, I know you haven't finalized the report, but just could you carry us one step further?
Yes.
Please do.
Oh, okay. We, as always in our reports, task the people we've left behind in the government to do better work than I think we were able to do. And so the first recommendation, paraphrase, is the U.S. government should consider the challenge of global water stress as a national security concern. That's sort of the approach we use for the #1 recommendation for each of our now 7, about to be 8 reports. And that, as I said, is the Department of Energy, it's USDA, it's all the elements of government in a concerted manner. Maintain and expand USAID development efforts. I notice on the attendance chart we have several USAID folks here. I think that a focus on the terrifically good work that USAID has been able to do, a history of which it's been able to do around the world, is laudable, but we need, I think, to have a better focus. Also, times may be tough in terms of funding, and so that moves in the same direction, emphasizing the focus that's required. Increased coordination on the international level. I think that it's important that the U.S. government, with all the mechanisms that it's able to muster, lead international efforts. And I see personally too many areas in which the U.S. is surrendering leadership, and I hope that can be reversed, particularly for water and for the development of the third world nations with regard to water and energy. We need a common forecasting tool. I don't mean weather forecasting. I don't even mean climate change forecasting. It needs to be more comprehensive than that. It needs to consider what the effects are going to be on indigenous populations, on geography, on the margins between agriculture, types of agriculture, those sorts of things. DOD should help avoid conflict, but as General Jones said, DOD should not be by any means the first resort. We're going to recommend that the geographic commands, of which there are 6 in the U.S. military national security structure, factor into all their planning the effects of energy and climate, and anticipate the water stresses that will result, and look at how to mitigate those to the extent of their ability, and maybe bring the forces of the combined U.S. government to bear where that's possible. I think we need to employ diplomatic instruments to mediate and thereby provide that additional layer of leadership. And finally, we need to suggest, and this is very CNA self-serving, we need to suggest the use of gaming in the planning structure, so that we have the participants who represent the stakeholders and the equities in a game actually making decisions as they would have to in the real world and seeing what the consequences are. CNA is terrific at that.
That's very good. Indeed, we had the experience with working with CNA to carry out a global food security game not more than 2 years ago.
See?
Yeah.
See?
But I would like to then sort of transition then to a public statements that General Jones has made recently, first in testimony that you submitted, and then in an op-ed piece with Admiral Mike Mullen, in which you underscored the importance of maintaining U.S. development assistance. And that was followed up, fortunately, by a number of other op-eds by congressional leaders and so forth. Now, an urgent domestic issue regards immigration challenges that are rising on our southern border, particularly from the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Degree of lawlessness, environmental problems. What responsibilities do you have as you framed the issue, the importance of development assistance? What responsibilities do you think that the U.S. government has to address those development issues, coupled with the new security challenges that are really quite severe in the region?
Right. Thank you. I was just recalled how important water is right here at home. A little known statistic is that the average serious American golfer walks about 200 miles during the year of playing golf. And during that time, that serious golfer will consume 20 gallons of water. So it's nice to know that the golfer gets about 10 miles to a gallon. So on the issue of the congressional testimony and the op-ed, we also recruited almost 20 four-star generals and admirals to sign a testimony that was introduced when Secretary Mattis And General Dunford testified in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee on the importance of development. And not cutting funds for USAID, not cutting development funds. In fact, if you really want to stop wars, you should increase those funds for all the reasons that everybody here knows quite well. But for me, it boils down to a question of our identity. I mean, who are we as the United States in the 21st century? I mean, if you look at what we did in 1945 and the contributions that we made towards, a livable planet, a survivable planet, nuclear proliferation was tamped down. We had international agreements, and all of this was done by one word, and that's leadership. I think I can speak for anybody who's served their government and been fortunate enough to serve it around the world, that one of the great prides in my life was just how people looked at the United States and depended on the United States for that kind of engagement and leadership. Yes, it's good to have a very strong military, and yes, it's sometimes necessary. But, who we are and what we do on this planet is much more important. And if we don't figure out a way to address it from a leadership standpoint with invitations to the collective number of countries who benefited by this kind of reconstruction in the 20th century, then I don't think we're providing the moral leadership that we should. It's a coming crisis, and if you wait too long to address it, it'll be too late. It'll just be a catastrophe. One other thing that I just have noticed in my lifetime is that we do really well focusing on East-West issues. That's what we focus on. We don't do really well on North-South issues, particularly in our own hemisphere. And also, I have to say, in the African continent. In 2003, I was asked to take over the US-European Command. That was the title, and I was happy to do that. But what was left unsaid in the US-European Command's title is the word Africa, because it included all of Africa except for the Horn. But nowhere in that title, since the US-European Command was created, was the word Africa even mentioned. Thankfully, now we have an African command. That's the good news. The bad news is it's located in Stuttgart, Germany, but they were happy. But we do have these unbelievable assets in our unified command structure: US7 Command, US Africa Command, US EUCOM, PACCOM, and I think those organizations should be modified to include more of a whole of government involvement, more representation of the key agencies in our government, our State Department, our Energy Department, our Commerce, our Department of Commerce, our Treasury, even the law enforcement. The United States is the only country on the planet that since 1945 has been welcomed as a permanent presence in so many different countries. And we've had some retrenchment in the sense that U.S. Southern Command is now in the United States. The Central Command is in Florida, but they all have forward headquarters in the theaters. And it is really a gift of the 20th century. I mean, it's a tremendous compliment to the United States that other countries want us to be there. And I happen to know of at least one African country that would like AFRICOM to move from Stuttgart into the continent. This ability to lead, to motivate, to get countries working together, to keep them moving towards democracy, keep them moving towards good governments, but also be aware of the fact that people are not going to stay where they are if there's no water, and if there's inadequate food, inadequate education, inadequate the basics for life. And if we can do that, and if we can work the public and private partnership, we can avoid a catastrophe that is surely heading our way collectively. And to me, it's one of the most important things that the United States can do. And it could be our legacy for the 21st century.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Ambassador Dobriansky, given your great diplomatic skills, let me ask you an undiplomatic question. And the current administration has framed its foreign policy as basically an America First approach. What advice could you offer those of us who, including some on this panel, who are committed to addressing the development and the water issues? How do we elevate those concerns in the context of this articulated foreign policy?
Right. Well, let me mention or answer this question sort of in two parts. First, on America First, I think that it does really focus on the concern about us, number one, and which, by the way, that matters to this conversation because of our infrastructure, because of our own water management. And I have to say the U.S. Water Partnership has done yeoman's work in bringing people together, particularly on the West Coast, talking about the drought, talking about many of the challenges and the issues in which states on the West Coast have been confronted with. So I'll start with, in my view, a real silver lining. And the silver lining is that this, I think, is an opportunity. I see it as an opportunity to look at the issues that, starting with us, that we need to deal with here at home. And by the way, some of our own solving of problems here also will have relevance to other countries. As you've all mentioned, the importance of our know-how, the importance of our technologies, all of these things, if we're successful in terms of resolving some of the challenges we have, the water management issues and water issues we have here at home, then that's going to be beneficial abroad. But let me go to the second part, and I think an important and core part. And that is, I think far too many people interpret that as meaning not being engaged internationally. I don't see it that way at all. I do see that it means looking at addressing our issues, also providing for ourselves a strong base, politically, economically, militarily, and at the same time, in fact, to be engaged internationally, but also to do it in a way that also looks at how does it relate to us and making sense for our own national security concerns. So in this regard, I think this is an issue that crosses borders. It's an issue that matters to all of us. And let me even, I'm going to cite Sherry Goodman. She's been mentioned several times here. She had an article, and she began the article saying during the 2016 campaign, President Trump stated that clean water would be a top priority of his administration, telling sciencedebate.org, quote, "It may be the most important issue we face as a nation for the next generation." I see this as not only an issue that is key domestically and part of the America First focus, but also as we engage foreign leaders. And as the president and his administration does this, and we do this through our embassies and through other means, I think we're going to find time and again that the way of bringing down costs, that the way of also opening up markets and opportunities, that this is an avenue. So I see it as an opportunity here to be seized upon.
Great. Thank you very much. At this point, I would like to shift the questioning to all of you in the audience, and I would like to take, say, 2 questions at a time. Please identify yourself, and if you have an affiliation, mention that as well, and we will make sure that the microphone gets to you. I see a gentleman here, and then a gentleman in the 3rd row. So I want to start in the back there. Okay, please.
Bob Walker with the Population Institute. Given the obviously critical importance of water security and the implications of projected population growth for water scarcity, I wonder if any of the speakers on the panel today would respond to the administration's proposal to defund international family planning.
And the second question we have right back here.
My name is Trey Taylor. My company is Verdant Power. It's a marine renewable energy company. We're currently producing, using the tides of New York's East River to produce electricity and clean water for Manhattan. My question is this, and all of you touched on it, given the global forces at play now, the whole nature of capitalism is changing. I also represent a group for the last 8 years that's very interested on the exportation of hybrid power systems with water management in mind. However, and given the changes, and we mentioned the public-private partnerships, what needs to happen now is business, government, and finance all working together. So my suggestion or question is this: how might we move toward, rather than public-private partnerships, private-public partnerships, to let entrepreneurs and innovators take the lead to be supported by government for the exportation of infrastructure, particularly to developing countries?
I invite all of you to respond to those two questions. Yeah. Paolo, you want to go?
Maybe I'll just jump
Ambassador,
in
yeah.
because I see them as interrelated. We know that there are a number of areas that have been put on the chopping block. But my response is let's wait and see. Let's see what the debate is. Let's see how this comes out. I think that part of it is in terms of also a number of areas. I think that, in terms of my own 25 years or over 25 years in government, I could tell you when I was Undersecretary for Global Issues, I had to fight a lot for funds. Some areas came easier, some areas didn't. And there were all sorts of considerations. So my answer up front would be, let's see how this comes out, because I think also where I see a plus here is that I see that there will be a vigorous debate and discussion over key development issues, and not just the area you focused on. There are a number of areas. But also your question relates to, I think, the second one. And that is, and General Jones certainly mentioned it, and that is in his own remarks about how this has changed in terms of public-private partnerships. I remember when I started my government career that we did very little with the private sector, that it was centrally and solely government-focused. Quite frankly, I think there are great opportunities here for bringing in the private sector, and where the private sector even takes full charge of certain areas. And in many ways, it could be done more timely, maybe more efficiently, and also because of it being localized. We find time and again when you have people who are on the ground in a certain locality, by the way, what might be good for New York City, is totally different for Los Angeles or for Seattle. So in that sense, I see creativity, I see advantages with technological growth and opportunities, particularly where I mentioned earlier how water can breed economic growth and innovation from that idea. And I think that complements also, what we look at on the government side. Again, what we rely on, and then maybe from administration to administration, what we can't rely on. At least I have found that from having had global issues in past years.
So very quickly, I think we absolutely need to do 5 things almost in sequence. The first is we need to have a clearly articulated policy for what it is, how we approach these issues. The second is that we need a clearly identified strategy. Some people try to do it the other way, but you need policy and then you need a strategy. And then we need to modernize the way the U.S. engages. And that's some government reform to make our institutions more agile and able to deal with the multiple issues that we face in addition to just the military equation. And fourth, I think we need to pay a lot of attention to our technology and our research and development base because frankly, technology is going to be a big driver in trying to lift these many hundreds and thousands of people in certain areas out of the condition that if they're not in it now, they're soon going to be in it. Technology plays. And then lastly, population management, and that's education on huge scales, because the worse off the country, the more children they produce, and so we need to figure that out. One other thing I would say is that in public-private partnerships, which I think is really one of the key solutions, it's very important that our government do not overregulate before they have to regulate. One of the things that enabled our energy good fortune was the fact that it was largely done by the private sector. I mean, the technology, the inventions, the fracking, converting oil sands and everything else, but this was a private sector driven, and fortunately the government did not overregulate it to start with. We have a problem now with cybersecurity, which is the technology is outstripping the capacity of regulators to govern it. We're eventually going to have to do that because it is a very, very serious problem. But it's an indication of where technology is so far out in front and developing and changing so quickly that our institutions are very slow in trying to regulate it. So I'm a big believer in deregulation as much as possible, unleashing the American genius in the private sector, and really make it part of a national solution that we back, that we back and we support, and I think that will do a lot towards restoring the prestige and the confidence that people have in our country.
Good. Paolo, you had a
just
hot
wanted-
pursuit before Admiral Gunn. Want to let the ambassador just
Do you,
finish
do you
her
mind?
comments?
I
Go-
just
go ahead.
wanted, I did not say this in my comment, but because I was focusing more on the particulars of the two questions, and your response was very strategic, I think. And so I'm going to.
It's easier.
I'm going to piggyback on that because I didn't say before, something that I would like to see is that the administration advance, some use the term a presidential policy directive. Personally, I like, during my time, that we use the term National Security Decision Directives, NSDDs. I'll give you an example of how you can take an area that you would not necessarily think would come into the security line, but I had the Office of Anti-Trafficking in Persons, and there was a National Security Decision Directive written on trafficking in persons. I think it was crucial because it actually galvanized support among all the agencies. It also provided a kind of internal mechanism for keeping watch, meaning not only of all the governmental agencies, but also in terms of its interchange with the private sector. So transfer that over in terms of also water. Even though there is this groundbreaking document, that's a global water strategy. This would be a response, a direct response, a call to action, as you and Steve Hadley have called for, by having a actual national security decision directive advanced on water, which I think also in of itself would be groundbreaking because it would make that statement about the priority attached to the issue. And it would do it very directly and very clearly, not only internally, but externally.
And I think you'd find a great deal of support for that suggestion. Admiral Gunn?
Yeah, a couple of brief things. One is with regard to the discussions of defunding this or that aspect of the federal government, that with that conversation that's going on now, I think we need to take a deep breath, see how it sorts out. There are 3 branches of government. The conversations are going to take place. I really like the idea of explicitly recognizing that there will be times when it will be far more productive for commercial interests, for the commercial sector to take the lead. And I think that it's important to decision makers in the commercial sector that there be predictability. So I really like your idea of a strategy, a roadmap, and the cooperation of those elements of government that are, we mentioned earlier that there was an array of tools at the assets available at the discretion of the United States to work on this. I think there should be 4. We mentioned 3, USAID, the banks, and geostrategic partnerships. but there should be 4. We should deliberately say that the commercial sector, enterprise, innovation, human energy in the United States has a contribution to make that has not been recognized sufficiently in the past.
Very nice, very nice. We have time for another round of questions. We have a microphone hand already, and then a question here down in front. So let's take those 2 questions. Please.
I'm Eagles Milbergs. I'm co-founder of a new nonprofit in Seattle called Pure Blue. It's focused on building the water innovation ecosystem in Puget Sound cluster. We fully endorse this idea of a public-private partnership and the private sector having a big role. I think having federal policies are great, et cetera, but you know, the private sector, the entrepreneurial sector, particularly in Puget Sound, the nonprofit sector, they're going to respond to a market signal. And one of the problems in this whole water area is no lack of desire of companies and entrepreneurs to serve this market. But the market is incredibly fragmented. It's very, very difficult. It's really not aggregated in any meaningful way for entrepreneurs to really take advantage of the opportunity. And so the question I have for you is, what can we do on the demand side, the user side of organizing, if you will, the demand side of this so that our private sector can get to work and deliver the solutions that the world needs?
All righty. Please, here in front.
Thanks very much, David. Hi, John Oldfield with Water 2017. Ambassador Dobriansky, just wanted to give you a chance to follow up on that EO, PPD, NSDD question or suggestion you've had. What can we do to help influencing the White House, this administration, whether it is drafting such a document or encouraging them to staff up the NSC, the NEC, OSTP, and so on appropriately? Second question for Admiral Gunn. You mentioned increased coordination on an international level. I'd like to give you a chance to give us a few more details on that. One thing I have a picture of is this huge remote sensing capability that we have in the United States to get ahead of sort of terrestrial water challenges. What more can we do from a public-private partnership capacity to make sure that our remote sensing data and visuals and so on gets into the right hands of water ministers, foreign ministers, environment ministers across the developing world? Thanks.
I'll take the second part of the question. I'm going to leave your question. I think it was somewhat because of your comments, at least I think. Look, my response is everything. A use of social media. This forum in of itself, I think, is important. I think the fact of the collaboration, the Wilson Center, the World Wildlife Fund, David's book, the different pieces there. Then I think about here, the military. To me, it's very striking how active and aggressive the military has been here, not only the Admiral in terms of the initiative that you put forward, but also, let me elaborate a little bit more. We had an event which the Atlantic Council had spearheaded for the U.S. Water Partnership, and we were very fortunate indeed to have 2 former national security advisors, General Jones and Steve Hadley, and they gave a call to action. And it was in that discussion, by the way, where also this very concept of having a policy directive also was enunciated. I think it's important. It would be, as I said, groundbreaking in addition to the other groundbreaking, but it would also be speaking about us. That's very targeted to us, meaning what our policy, U.S. policy is. The other one is focused on a global, it's a global strategy. So use all opportunities to strategize, whether it's through the executive branch, directly with the legislative branch. And by the way, I wanted to mention, because there are a number of people here formerly from the State Department. Tim Latimer, who was in the Oceans Environment Science Bureau. We worked together, Bud Rock also, and then Russ Fisby, who's here, a Latin America specialist. But why I'm mentioning them, because also, by the way, there are a lot of people who are real advocates of this, who've also been in government and who are very committed and who are very dedicated to these issues. Partner with them.
General Jones, did you? Yep.
I think that one of the problems we have in communications is that we have great ideas, and we have vision, and we can motivate a lot of people to say, yeah, that's right. But then you get to the question of, okay, how are you going to do this? What's the economic driver? Because ultimately it costs money. It's either public money or private money or a combination of both. I think what's lacking is a proof of concept, a success. And one of the things that we've been kicking around is that with all kinds of organizations, including NGOs, like the One campaign with Bono and people like that, Bill Gates, and governments and private sector, is pick a region, significant region, let's say somewhere in Africa, and get the EU, the AU, NATO, UN, NGOs, Red Cross, whatever it is, and say, this region that we're going to pick is going to be a proof of concept. And we're going to tackle three main pillars. We're going to tackle security, and I don't mean just the U.S., I mean we collectively, the participating countries. We're going to tackle economic development. We're going to create jobs. And there's a lot of subsets to this, like education and roads and schools and things like that. And then the third thing is, in order to qualify for this proof of concept, the government is going to pledge itself to do more work on governance and rule of law. And those three pillars across you pick the region. It should be big enough to capture people's interests. I think as an experiment, it would be very, very interesting to see how quickly things could possibly change. And I cite an organization like NATO, because NATO is still stuck in the 20th century mentality of the defense of Europe against Russia. I mean, now it's then Soviet Union, but now Russia. And I love NATO, but you can't have 28 countries, and then 29 now, with Montenegro, but 29 countries just sitting around waiting to react to a Russian incursion that probably won't come, at least in a World War type scenario. Instead, you could take an organization like NATO with their armies, navies, and air forces and focus them on helping to prevent future conflict instead of reacting to it. I think if we got a proof of concept and we got the participation, water is included in all of this, obviously. You could do something that would really capture the imagination and get this thing going. But I think you need that win. Sorry to go on for
No, very nice.
Well, I'd like to add energy to that, because as I said before, I think it's the connection between energy and water is inextricable. The demand for energy is surging. The move to renewables, to advanced energy, is necessary, and the momentum is already there, with or without us. And so I think that with the water is a great way to pursue what General Jones suggests. I had listed the organizations internationally in answer to that question. My list was less complete than the former national security advisors. Gee, I wonder why that was.
We rely on the Navy, though, to take us where we need to go.
I think you and I have had that discussion before. The last thing I would mention is that probably a U.S. chamber or some domestic business-oriented collection of organizations should be involved. And then I got to tell you, I hate to be fawning here, but this book is very useful. I think when you look at the international opportunities that can be changed from an urgent need into a productive process are resident in many of these chapters. They're well written, well researched, terrifically well documented, and so I love the book. Can I say that one more time?
Well, It's time to close. It's obvious. I mean, you have to close on such a great high. Well, thank you ever so much. Judging from the number of hands that were shooting up in the earlier round, we could continue, I am sure, for quite a while longer. Unfortunately, I am obliged at this point to turn the discussion back to Roger Mark, who will close our session today. So, Roger Mark, thank you very much.
Conversation we've had today. Good to have the microphone working. And I know that we'll continue the discussion as we move into our reception now. But as I reflect on the discussion that we've had today, I think we started by looking at what are some of the drivers. And those of us who have written the chapters for the book, as you look at the book and as you read it, you will see that we have identified that by looking at what we call paths of influence. And each of the 14 geographic case studies goes through these paths where we talk about societal, ecological, and human system drivers that infuse the various things that we've been talking about today on the panel. So I think this conversation about drivers was really critical. And I think coming away from the panel discussion, it's quite clear that there was no one driver across the case study. So that's a very clear message coming out of the book. I think in our discussion today, we sort of build on this case of what are the drivers to think about how we navigate this complexity. So as we talk in the book about the paths of influence, very often we talk about what are the feedback mechanisms, how does that impact the responses, and what does it mean for U.S. strategic interests. So we go from drivers to these paths of influence to the responses and trying to figure out how we navigate that complexity and ultimately why is that in our interest. And I think these questions around causality and response and opportunities very much came out in our discussion today. I think one of the other factors that came out is the importance of actors and different actors who come to the table. We talk about government and at various levels, at various scales, but the importance of non-scale actors. We spoke about communities, we spoke about indigenous peoples, and that was a very important theme that I think was also reflected in the book. I was quite pleased that the panel also spoke about the broader portfolio and the nature of these challenges. It is not static. It is changing, it's dynamic, and I think that's where one consistent message that we heard in the panel and that is true throughout the cases. So thinking about the drivers and how we navigate the complexity, we said, okay, well, what does that mean for our strategy? And our panelists said, okay, let's start by first taking a deep breath, just pausing for a moment to trying to figure out what is the landscape. And we talked about responses in the panel discussion today at various levels. We looked at diplomacy, the role of defense in the military, the role of development, quite a lot of conversation about USAID, but also looking at what this means for bilateral responses, multilateral responses, and geostrategic responses. So really thinking about how those different components come together. We looked at this also at various scales. Very clear in our discussion today. We talked about what it means for the erosion of rural livelihoods, how we look at this at a subnational level, a national level, regional level, and in a transboundary way. So a very important consideration of scales. The question of partnerships, public-private partnerships, who's at the table, what it means for collaboration, how we engage communities, but also how we bring in the commercial sector was one, I think, a key discussion that we also had today. What does that mean for a whole of government approach as we try to pull this together, and what are the opportunities when we can share resources across boundaries? Ultimately, some questions about what it meant in terms of how we look at future threats? What does it mean for common forecasting tools? And where are some of the gaps? We're well established to look at these issues from an east-west perspective, but maybe not so well established from a north-south perspective. So what does that mean? And how do we deal with the current political realities? How do we phrase these issues in an America First context and present that politically, economically, and militarily? So quite a bit was covered building on the book. Also recognizing the importance of thinking of national security directives. How do we think about that as part of how we contextualize these threats and what it means for us? And then we also had this 5-point approach that we could be thinking about, needing to have a clear policy, a clear strategy, modernizing our engagement, technology research and development, and even bringing in questions on demography and population management. So, wow. No wonder you read this book in Rome. So once again, I think we come away from our discussion here looking at these 14 geographic case studies to understand it. If you're interested in why U.S. Security interests are so intricately tied to questions around water and instability, that this is clear, essential reading, whether you're in Rome or elsewhere. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about that as we move to our reception. So thank you so very much. And I'm really thrilled that in the reception, we'll also have an opportunity to engage some of our colleagues from the World Bank. So we have Kristalina Georgieva, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the World Bank, who will be joining us for the reception and making some comments to contextualize this discussion today. So as those of you who are familiar with our program here at the Wilson Center, you know that this has been webcast live. So we will have a video archive of our discussion today, and on our blog post platform, New Security Beat, we will be producing a summary of our discussion today to complement the book. So grab your copy of the book, join me in thanking the panel, and my colleagues will direct you to our reception.
That's a bit overwhelming.
Well, there was a ton of work in that, and it really turns out to be a great source document.
Very, 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 very.
Thank you. Yeah, always a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, absolutely.